I have a question for you this morning. What would you consider to be foolishness? When I was preparing this sermon this week, I started to think about what would be considered foolishness and what wouldn't. We all know some things that would be considered foolishness, like driving a car under the influence of alcohol, or driving a car at 60 miles an hour in a 30-mile-an-hour speed limit. Both those things would be considered foolishness because we know that they would cause injury to others, cause hurt, and maybe even loss of life. But it becomes more difficult to determine what's foolishness if one person views one thing differently to another. Let's think about the following situation. A man has a job that requires him to work away from his family for many, many days at a time. He often has to bring work home with him, meaning that even when he is with his family, no one is actually quite sure whether or not the time that he has with them is his or whether it's there for his work. Now, is that considered foolishness or not? For some, that would be foolish, because not having a healthy working family life balance is not good for this man's pattern of life. It can cause detrimental effects on his family relationships and can, in some worst cases, cause family breakdown. For others, though, that's not foolishness, because it might be the only way in which this man can provide for his family, pay the bills, and also ensure that he gets on in his career. Foolishness, you see, is not always as easily defined as we would wish, and it's often defined by those who want to make it so. The spending cuts that the government have made over the last 8 years might be considered by those who've been affected by them to be considered foolishness. But then again, when the country had the credit crisis in 2008, it had detrimental effects on our economy, so the government had to do something, and spending cuts therefore might have been seen as the only alternative in order to solve that problem. Again, it is considered foolish by those who are now struggling, but it is considered by others to be the only way in which the government was able to get itself out of the financial mess it had got itself into. Again, defining something as foolishness is dependent on the way in which someone views it. And the same is true of our reading from 1 Corinthians chapter 1 today. This reading is often viewed by Christians as the one that takes us to the very heart of what the gospel message is all about. When people question the need for the crucifixion and even challenge its purpose, many Christians will say that this is something beyond our understanding. We can't know what the purpose or meaning of the cross is, because to us it would be considered foolishness. But to God, it is the way in which it changes life and brings us close back into the right relationship with Him once more. It demonstrates the very essence of what is considered to be love and is the biggest expression of God's love for us. And although it leaves us confused, it transforms us from where we were to where God actually wants us to be. This understanding, however, does not give us the true meaning of this passage, because Paul is not actually that interested in what the crucifixion achieves as to what its knowledge is at this moment in time doing to the Corinthian church. As we know, the Corinthian church was a very divided community, and we know from Paul's dealings with them that there were a number of occasions when they simply got it wrong. And they got it wrong about their relationships with each other, but also in their understanding of their relationship with God too. We have evidence from the New Testament that Paul wrote at least 2 letters to them, but it's more likely to be 4, theologians say. And when he writes to the Corinthian church on those occasions, he airs a lot of his concerns about the way in which they are conducting their lives with each other and also in their relationship with God. And from the way in which Paul writes, we can sense an increasing amount of frustration as time and again the Corinthians just don't get it. And here in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, we have a prime example of the type of confusion that Paul had to try and overcome. Just before we get into this benchmark passage on what is foolishness and what isn't, we have Paul's anger expressed over the divisions that there are within the church. We hear him talking about 3 groups that have emerged and formed as a result of each person in Corinth claiming to have true knowledge of what it means to be in relationship with God. And one group is saying this. They're saying, I'm for Paul. I'm for Paul because Paul has come and told us how we should be in our relationship with God. Another one is saying, I'm for Apollos. You know, Paul might have come and told us about our relationship with God, but it's Apollos who's really given us understanding. And then there's another group altogether called the Christ Party saying, I'm for Christ. You know, Paul and Apollos might have told us something about God, but actually we want to be in the right relationship with God, so we're going to claim to be for Christ. And each of these groups is saying that their superior knowledge of God brings them closer into relationship with him. Now, Paul is absolutely furious about this, because how can the body of Christ be so divided, he says. If all are to be in relationship with God, all must be treated as equals, and all should be valued for the contribution that they make. But it is in this context of claiming superior knowledge that leads Paul to setting up the crucifixion as foolishness. The different groups, you see, are clearly saying that it is because of their knowledge of the crucifixion that knowledge draws them closer to God. And they're using that knowledge to challenge others. They're saying, look, I know something about the crucifixion that you don't. But in so doing, Paul is saying that they're making a mockery of what the cross achieves and are distancing themselves from God as a result. In fact, the whole church is being alienated from God's presence simply because they're trying to get one over on each other effectively. And Paul says, no one can really know what God was thinking when the crucifixion occurred. No one can say that they truly understand how we're brought back into the correct relationship with God, because as we look at the cross, all we see is its pain and its humiliation. It is complete foolishness by our understanding. And if we try and claim that there is any wisdom by our human standards, Paul says it leaves us no better off than if we were the Jews or the Greeks, who consider all of this to just simply be a stumbling block to being in the right relationship with God. What Paul is actually saying here is that pride is getting in the way of being in the right relationship with God. And he suggests that all this superior knowledge is doing is bringing out division rather than building people up in the actual knowledge and the love of God. We know this happens in our own lives. We know how good it feels when we have a knowledge of something that no one else has. People look up to us with a bit of respect. They hang on the words that we say, and they even act upon them because they think we know what is right. And with that, There is a real sense of power. And the Corinthian church are using that knowledge as a superior sense of power, as a superior sense of access to God. But unless they use that knowledge wisely and build people up and share the love of God, actually all that happens is that you use that knowledge in a painful way, in a way that says, nah, I'm better than you. But unless you use your knowledge wisely and encourage people to discover things for themselves, all that is ever created, all that ever is achieved is a superiority complex. And that's what Paul is challenging in this reading. I've often felt a bit like this when I've been in ministry. I often felt that people consider me to have a superior knowledge and an understanding of what it means to be in relationship with God. Now, when I was training, I had a real desire to encourage team ministry. I didn't feel myself at all to be superior to others. And in fact, over the time that I've been a minister, as I've engaged in ministry and worked with people, I've encountered a lot of people who I actually consider to be a lot more spiritual and a lot closer in relationship to God than I am. Actually, I've considered them to be more faithful than me. If anything, in the pastoral encounters that I have had over the last 10 years, I have felt a sense in which I've not ministered to others, but been ministered to myself. However, for whatever reason, it is that people consider this, I have noticed that people often feel unable or unworthy to do even the smallest thing within the church community without the approval or at least getting the wisdom of the minister. And they'll approach me as minister for the wisdom that they need to carry out a particular task. Now, in my case, I've often had to refer people on to others because the questions I've been asked, I felt unqualified to answer and to be able to assist in. Yes, I might have a little bit of knowledge about something and I might have shared that, but then I've gone on to say, look, you really need to speak to this person about this because they're better able to do that. Now, that's not to degrade the role that a minister has in any way. But we are all called to minister to each other, to draw upon the gathered wisdom and the gathered knowledge of those who are part of the church community, and to move forward together with the contributions that everyone makes. We only draw close to God when we all are valued as equal. And this is what Paul is trying to encourage when he challenges the Corinthian community about their knowledge of God's love. Paul says that using knowledge to try and hold power over others only leads to division. Paul seeks to overcome this pride that he says has started to infect the people of Corinth, and says later in his letter that knowledge puffs people up. But then he goes on to say, but love builds up. This encouragement is clear in what follows in the passage that we've just heard today. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 2 that he didn't come to the people of Corinth speaking with an eloquence or a superior wisdom, but rather started his testimony of God and God's love among them from where they were, and then, and only then, move them on through their shared wisdom and their shared experience of God to a place where they could experience the love and the relationship that God was offering to them that was faithful to their needs. And this is what Paul encourages them and us to do today. Not to say that one is closer to God than others, or to say that one has more knowledge than others, but to say that together the shared love and the care that God gives to all leads to a greater experience of relationship with him. What is foolishness according to this passage then? Boasting in something that is only considered foolishness by the world standards and claiming that that foolishness brings us closer to God. We cannot understand the wisdom of the cross that brings us back into a fulfilled relationship with God. We can only experience the love and relationship that results from it. And as a community, we are called and encouraged to share that relationship with each other so that we can boast together in the love of God and deepen our understanding together of what it means for us and for the world. Amen.